Test, test, test. Test, test, test.
Recording in progress.
Yeah, just please. We're doing a live feed. So, yeah. Okay, we got water. I was gonna put one over here. Like this, I can get that one. So we want to just change this to. And then you want to. No, you were saying there's a way that you could do it so we can see it change.
It should be F8, not F5. Okay. And duplicate. And escape. And then present this. Yep. Click on it. And then
That's
now
good.
we're good.
Yeah. Use the ID.
Pause and gracefully step back.
So Benjamin.
Good morning. On behalf of Preservation Virginia and Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation, I want to welcome you to historic Jamestown. I'm Elizabeth Castelny, CEO for Preservation Virginia. As we begin, Preservation Virginia and the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation acknowledge the indigenous people who are the original inhabitants of the land we now call Jamestown. The Chiranahuaca, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Patawamak, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes. We pay our respect to their tribal members, past and present. We further acknowledge the complex and difficult history of enslavement of African men and women that came to these shores unwillingly in 1619. Understanding their stories and the persistent legacies of this history deepens our understanding of the past and helps to guide our future. We're grateful to be joined soon by Senator Kaine. He will be joining us a little bit later in the program. Rob Newig from the National Trust, and joining us here as well are my historic Jamestown colleagues, Dr. Jim Horn, President of the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation, David Givens, Director of Archaeology, and Michael Lavin, Director of Collections and Conservation. They will soon share with you an urgent need here at Historic Jamestown. I want to recognize Superintendent Jerry Marr and Deputy Superintendent Steve Williams, our partners from the National Park Service that also join us, as well as from James City County Board of Supervisors, John McLennan, who's the chair, and Ruth Larson, County Administrator Scott Stevens, and Randy Riffle, who is attending for Delegate Mullen's office. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here on this historic day. In 1889, the founders of APVA, now Preservation Virginia, began a national campaign to save Jamestown. Years of abandonment threatened the stability of the 17th century church tower, and at the same time, the James River's lapping waters undermined the shoreline. The archaeological remains of the 1607 James Fort were yet to be known, but the women marshaled their influence to lobby a succession of private property owners, the General Assembly, and Congress. And they were successful in acquiring 22.5 acres, restoring the church tower, and constructing a seawall, all with a single-minded intention to preserve the site of the first permanent English settlement in North America, where Virginia Indians, English colonists, and enslaved Africans interacted to plant the seeds of our uniquely American democracy. Now, 129 years later, Jamestown's future is threatened once again. And Preservation Virginia and the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation are seeking renewed national and international attention to save Jamestown. Our speakers this morning will outline the urgent threats posed by recurrent flooding and sea level rise. They will describe the concepts to mitigate the impacts and address the inundation. And they'll describe how these approaches can be modeled solutions for other cultural and resources facing similar challenges. Now, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Rob Newig, Vice President for Preservation Services and Outreach at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. In a career that spans more than 33 years, Rob has been an outspoken advocate and coalition builder, intent on saving historic places for people and ensuring that we have places that deepen our understanding of the full telling of American history. He's been a dedicated friend and partner to Preservation Virginia, and I welcome Rob Newig.
Thank you. Good morning, and I want to recognize also the public officials elected and appointed here and the National Trust's longtime partners, the National Park Service. Good morning, all. As Elizabeth said, I'm here on behalf of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is a privately funded nonprofit organization which has been working since we were chartered in 1949 to save historic places that tell the full story of American history. I'm here today to announce that Jamestown, this nationally and internationally significant place, to announce that Jamestown has been named to the 2022 list of the 11 most endangered places in America. This is bittersweet news. Each year, our 11 most endangered list shines a spotlight on important historic places that are urgently threatened. And unfortunately, Jamestown is one of those places. We've listed Jamestown this year because it is a place, as I say, of national and international significance, and because the fragile historic and archaeological remains here are under daily threat from the growing impacts of climate change. Jamestown, as you know, represents the meshing of cultures in North America, from 12,000 years of indigenous history to the arrival of English settlers and the forced migration of enslaved people from Africa. Archaeology here, led by the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation, has deepened our understanding of this place and of our nation, as well as the vulnerability of this place. Today, we're all standing on an island that is just 3 feet above sea level, long vulnerable to storms and flooding. These threats are increasing significantly due to sea level rise along the James, compounded by more extreme storm events, hurricanes, and tides. As you'll hear later this morning, the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation has developed a thoughtful, multi-layered plan to protect Jamestown from rising waters and from storms. Implementation of this plan, however, must proceed quickly to avoid further risk and further damage to this place. Preservation Virginia and Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation need partners and need funding to carry out their climate change mitigation plan to save Jamestown. Many low-lying communities and low-lying historic sites are vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding. And the National Trust believes that the preservation strategies developed for Jamestown can serve as models for other similarly vulnerable sites in Virginia, but also across our nation. This listing is part of a listing of 11, and I urge you to go to the National Trust website, which is savingplaces.org, to learn about the other 10 sites. Again, we're here this morning with our partners to announce that Jamestown is on this list of America's 11 most endangered historic places. and to commit the National Trust to supporting the efforts of Preservation Virginia, Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation, and others to address the threats of climate change to this fragile and important place. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Horn. I'm president of the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation. And I would like to thank Elizabeth and Rob, and particularly the National Trust, for this announcement, which will help us gain the visibility that is going to be so critical to our fundraising campaign. I'd like to thank also and recognize that we have several members of our board here, and I'd like to thank them for coming along and participating in this event, and also to our friends and colleagues from the National Park Service, our partners on this unique island. I'm going to ring the Jamestown bell, and I'm going to give you a heads up about this because it can take you a bit by surprise, those who haven't seen me or anyone else ring the bell, because I'm going to ring it like this. So no ropes, I'm afraid. That is an exact replica of the original Jamestown bell that rang out across the site 400 years ago. In the earliest churches here at Jamestown, 1608 church, and this church, which dates from 1617-18. And thanks to the Jamestown Society for sponsoring that bell. And it was rung during times when there was a call for divine service, during times when people were called together for work schedules, and also, of course, during times of great danger and imminent threat. It's located, there is actually a real bell up there. It's located in that little belfry in the timber framing. Now, I'm ringing the bell today, and we'll keep on ringing it, because this is a call for action. This bell is symbolic of the imminent threat that we face today from climate change, and what Rob and Elizabeth have mentioned are the key threats to the viability of this island. And again, I want to underline that Jamestown is one of the most important and consequential historic sites in our nation. The potentially disastrous losses from the impacts of climate change, from storm events, from the tidal surges, from flooding, are ripping away at the fabric, eroding the very fabric of this island. Water, I think I'm right in saying this, water is not the friend of archaeologists, at least those that work on the land as opposed to underwater archaeologists. So in calling upon the nation to help us with this cultural resource of enormous value, we are ringing the Jamestown bell as a symbol of the campaign that we are launching today. Now, sometimes when you hear about climate change, it will be along the lines of, well, by 2050, we will need to do this or need to do that, or if we haven't done it in the next 35 years, it's going to be difficult. What I want to underline is that the next 5 years are critical to us to begin to take those measures that need to be implemented as soon as we possibly can. If we miss that window, if we miss the window of the next 5 years, then the challenges in terms of implementing, bringing in those remedial measures that we need to take will become much, much more difficult in the future. So we have an urgency about this call to action. This is not something that we can delay. So thank you again for being with us and joining us this morning. I'm going to now turn over to my two colleagues, Michael Lavid, Director of Collections and Conservation, and David Givens, Director of Archaeology. And they're going to show you some of the alarming images and some of the information that we've been gathering, because I think this gives you a very immediate and graphic sense of the challenges ahead. There are solutions, and we want to discuss those with you throughout the morning. But for now, Michael and Dave, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction, Jim. As you can see, we're here on Jamestown Island, and I hope you had an opportunity to take the footbridge on the way in and to witness some of the sea level rise that we are experiencing here at Jamestown today. This is a drone image from directly above the footbridge showing how the island is basically being cut in half by the extension of the pitch and tar swamp. This is to the east, and this is towards the west, and we're on the church, in the church just to the left of the screen. As you can see, there's about a foot of standing water constantly on Preservation Virginia's portion of the island. Currently, the James City County map has designated over 7.5 acres of this property as being wetland. So a third of the property has been lost to sea level rise currently. And Dave will talk to the archaeology resources that are in that area. And the engineered system that was designed in the 1950s to mitigate some of these issues, again, designed in the 1950s for 1950s events, has now become overwhelmed in the 2020s. We've done a lot of research onto the understanding of the exact elevations of the portions of the property. And with our partners at VHB and Steeman and Peace Architecture have looked at historic data. And now with the most recent datum put up at the Jamestown Ferry, we are flooding 5 to 6 times a year on average of around 3.2 feet of elevation. And that's what it looks like when you put that data onto elevation model for the island. We are being inundated. Now that is a flood issue to 3.2 feet. This is a flood to the about the average height of the seawall of 6.2 feet. And that would basically inundate about 16, 17 acres of the property. Hurricane Isabel in 2003 was over 8.5 feet. This is historical data that has now been combined with projections for sea level rise. And we are following the intermediate or basically historical data being extrapolated out. And that 3.2 feet that you saw that was an average flood 5 to 6 times a year will be the norm sometime between 2070 and 2080. Now, we are historical archaeologists. We love old maps and documentation. So we are going to always go back to the earliest instances. And this map is from 1664. And it's showing an area nearby where the Ambler House currently sits. And it shows just, you can barely see it. It's Mr. Knowles Bridge crossing a branch of pitch and tar swamp. Pitch and tar swamp is to the east of this. And that he actually gets from Yardley. So Yardley had this bridge, basically bridge/dam, constructed in 1619. And we believe that was a way to mitigate what he was experiencing in the 17th century. And we're going to borrow some thoughts from that. There's also the 1781 map showing the southwestern end of the island being dry. This 1877 coastal, same situation. And then Young in 1907 records a branch of pitch and tar swamp cutting through the property, so a very narrow portion. We also have historic images of this area of the property, showing it basically drained by a series of ditches. Here's another view. This is about 1929. And then this is a February 1st, 1927 image of the property. Again, just a series of ditches. This is a comparison, this was done by VHB, a comparison of the 1907 limits of what he witnessed with the branch of the pitch and tar swamp to what is currently mapped as the inundation. And then this is an overlay of archaeological features on that. And Dave, again, will talk more to that, of that 6.2 feet height of the seawall. We have worked with our partners to create a conceptual plan that has many tools in this toolkit that we can apply to the situation that we are seeing here at Jamestown. And we would be happy to talk to you after the lecture here about all of the different things that we have explored. One thing, though, we do know, this will be in the tens of millions of dollars in order to save Jamestown. And this is what our concept mitigation would look like with that berm in place in order to hold back the flooding waters up to the height of the seawall. Now, this was probably the scariest graphic that VHB shared with me, and it's readily available on the NOAA site. And it's documented sea level change since 1929, and this graphic goes to 2021. That is 1.62 feet of documented sea level rise since 1929. And this is a graphic from 1960 to about 2019 with those projections that you saw on the earlier graphic. With the green line, you see the fourth one from the top being just following the trend. And you can see how aggressive that gets, and that's in meters on the left. So this is a scary situation. This image on the left shows Jamie May standing at the Yardley House gates. Across Smith's Field is the Dale House. And this is what we expect. And this is a normal 3-foot rise due to flooding. This will be the situation at Jamestown if no action is taken immediately. And then this is also an image, a drone image of what that flooding looks like from the air. And it's pretty impressive how much land will be underwater. And it also should be noted that there are successful projects in this area that have addressed sea level rise, and that folks can go and visit and learn from what they have implemented and how that can apply to sea level rise and climate change at Jamestown. And we are going to be borrowing some of the ideas for projects like this Ohio Creek project in Norfolk, where it was a public-private partnership in order to protect this historically Black neighborhood. Thank you.
Morning. I'm Dave Givens, the Director of Archaeology here at the Jamestown Rediscovery Program. And I wanted to show you guys a little bit of what's at stake here. Traditionally, when we think about sea level rise, climate change, archaeology isn't really the focus of that discussion. But here on Jamestown Island, you have the intersection of the visible intersection, the tangible notion of the intersection of climate change and sea level rise and archaeology. Now, it is known through our work over the past 28 years that adaptation and change to a diverse climate has been the case. It's certainly for Virginia Indians that were here, as Rob said, for over 12,000 years, the first English and first Africans that arrived in August of 1619. So it is of great import that we study the detailed and significant information that's here. And it's not that video is John Smith's well, and the deep wells and pits and cellars that we have here are containers of shared history and excellent preserved information that is in front of this climate change, sea level rise train that we now are undergoing. And it is not to be understated that history is shared. The site and throughout the property, Preservation Virginia property, we not only have the first permanent English settlement, but there are First People sites down near the location of this encroaching wetlands. Of course, the first English, and then again, first Africans arrival and sites throughout the island over time. Now, the threats that we face and we address are both manifold in many different ways, but chiefly in terms of weather, the island being low-lying, and on the coastal areas, we suffer nor'easters and hurricanes. And this is an excellent example that was video taken by our director of museums, Jamie May. And it shows how what my colleagues had said, where water just inundates the property, overruns the property. This is the same image, but a drone shot that Michael showed as we go from west to east across the property in a recent nor'easter that floods the property and cultural resources, both in low-lying areas, but then begins to threaten resources that are buried. So we must think not only of the water inundation on top of the ground, but what's going on under the ground. And those affect everything from our seawall. And you guys probably saw the barges that were located out there today. This is something we're working on. And the seawall is an historic property. It was put in 1901, 1904 to save this portion of Jamestown Island, and has been the brunt of many of these storms, both in front and behind. Most recently, the archaeological team was working down to figure out what the far reaches of the eastern part of the 1607 fort looked like. And the entire time we were battling this issue of sea level rise climate change, in which the tide would come in. And this is something we didn't experience 20 years ago when we were working there. Tide would come in, flood that location. We'd have to pump it out just so we could work and eventually attain the information we needed in a safe manner, and then preserved it and backfilled it, hoping to go back in a future date. But this is an excellent example of the things we face. Now, the very people who lived and died at the beginning of our nation are also under threat. This is 3 individuals that are 200 paces west of the church tower that were the focus in 1893 when Preservation Virginia attained the property. There was a complaint that human remains were eroding out of the Confederate earthworks that were here. These are the same burial ground, and those graves, through meteoric water, rainwater, are constantly soaked dry. And we know through our experience and the history of this project, the 28-year history, that this has an adverse effect on the very people who founded this colony. Now, we, of course, will adapt and change just like our predecessors. And so we're developing unique tools through geographic information systems and looking underground. But the threat, as Michael mentioned, is principally the landward side, as we figured out through our research. And once you put something like the seawall under a microscope for our archaeologists, then we start to understand the bigger picture. So in examples of how we combat sea level rise, climate change, and the right team at the right time, this is the team doing a geophysical study of the seawall to look for voids, and we're happy to say there was minimal damage. That where we did see damage was where the pitch and tar swamp was encroaching and pushing hydraulic pressure from behind. So that's an example of how we shifted and adapted to our new understanding. Now the property as a whole will undergo phasing, and there is a sense of urgency to that, and that's not to be understated about what's underground. And we're thankful and blessed to have partners like the Park Service who, along with Preservation Virginia archaeologists, have over 100 years of archaeology that's represented and that we can attain and add to our understanding of the property. Now I wanted to show you guys a small portion just out here over near the swamp that we did some geophysical work on. And one of the really interesting things, and what we didn't realize would come out of this, was the redacted portion at the top of the image to the north is actually the water inundation. So the radar was showing us where and how far the radar came in. And over time, we will be using that as a tool to non-invasively look at the property and plan for not only the present, but the future. The other features you see on here is the Great Road. That was on the map in 1957. You'll see lot lines and other utilities. So absolutely fantastic. And then here, this is the team most recently using ground penetrating radar to actually study the pitch and tar swamp. And I wanted the audience to know that over time, Jamestown will be a teaching tool and will develop toolkits for not only our colleagues, but future archaeologists to address that. And this is a off-the-shelf drone that we've been using to model the climate change and damage to the property. So very quickly, we can take, again, off the shelf, something you buy at Best Buy, create a model of the site and have a digital elevation model very inexpensively to look at land loss over time. So you see the central area of the swamp is where soils have deflated. And so we can use these tools to track that over time. So we follow in the footsteps of many before us, and we certainly will rise to the occasion in this very dire news. And I think that the story of Jamestown is adaptation and change, and we certainly will rise up to that occasion and succeed. So thank you guys very much.
We're going to be joined by Senator Kaine, so just give us a second.
Everybody can hear me?
We can, Senator. Thank.
And is that Elizabeth? Is that Elizabeth speaking?
It is Elizabeth. I guess you can't see me.
Well, Elizabeth, I'm really happy to join. I've been signed on for about 10 or 15 minutes listening to you all, and I appreciate the opportunity to address you today. Thanks to Preservation Virginia, the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation for bringing us together to talk about such an important issue about climate change in historic Jamestown. As governor, I was very, very proud. One of the most memorable moments of my life was welcoming Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip to Jamestown to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the birth of our nation in May of 2007. And I had a more recent interaction with Jamestown, but I just want to show you this picture. This is me on the undeveloped eastern edge of Jamestown Island in October, just this past October. I decided to do the entire James River this year. So I started at Iron Gate in Allegheny County, and over the course of 26 days in the spring, summer, and fall, I canoed all the way to Portland Road, where the Hampton Roads enters into the Chesapeake Bay. And that beach, some of you are familiar with it, the eastern end of Jamestown Island is undeveloped, and I just pulled my canoe over and sat on a piece of driftwood, and I looked across the river, and it didn't look that different to me than it must have looked to John Smith and others who were living there at the time. And I was reminded again, as I was when I was governor, what a special place this is. However, we've got to have a frank conversation about not the last 400 years, but the next 100. How will the next 100 years look for this historic site? How can we rally to save a place that we treasure as lovers of history, as Virginians, and as Americans? My dear friend, the departed civil rights lawyer Oliver Hill, talked about Jamestown as the place of the Big Bang, the combination of Native American population, European population, and African population that led to the creation of modern America. Cultures meshed from 12,000 years of indigenous people to the arrival of English settlers, 1607, and the forced migration of enslaved people from Africa in 1619. And our nation's fundamental principles, equality, governance by an elected body, freedom of religious worship, all were born out of experiences, some triumphant and some very, very painful, at Jamestown on the acreage where you're now sitting. Preservation Virginia has for more than a century worked to preserve critical historical sites like Jamestown so that hundreds of thousands of visitors from across the world can share in the stories of the past, but also think about our future together. And you have been able to, in that past century, uncover 85% of the 17th century fort and over 3 million artifacts. That's kind of staggering to imagine. And those artifacts have told the story of Jamestown, including changing some conventional wisdom about Jamestown and folks who live there. So today, we're together sounding the alarm that Jamestown needs to boost from the public and a rally by advocates if we're to value this cultural asset and protect it from sea level rise and climate change. I saw the effects of sea level rise and climate change as I canoed along the James River in 2021. Sea level rise, more frequent storms, recurrent flooding, they threaten many beautiful areas along the James, including the original Jamestown site, further compromising the fragile island and threatening its important cultural resources, as previous speakers have described. By the end of the century, climate models are showing us that Jamestown could be entirely underwater. And the good news is that the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation has a plan to engineer solutions to help the site adapt to immediate threats posed by sea level rise and other extreme weather events, which are slated to increase. And working on the infrastructure bill that we passed this year and traveling around the state and talking to, whether it's in Richmond or Lynchburg or Alexandria, cities that deal with combined sewer overflow. They're trying to clean up the river. Their task is made much more complicated by the increase of severe storms. So this is a Jamestown issue, but we see the effects of sea level rise and extreme weather all around the James and other tributaries as well. So we need partners, we need funding if we're going to implement climate change mitigation plans. As one of the speakers before me indicated, the story of Jamestown has been a story of resilience and adaptation. And so in that sense, the future challenge is one that Jamestown has dealt with in the past. I'm really, really grateful to the National Trust for stepping up to amplify this message by including Jamestown in the 11 most endangered list. And I am really familiar with the powerful influence that the Trust can exercise in this area. In 2020, the Trust added Rassawak, the Monacan Indians' ancestral capital that was bustling at the time Jamestown was settled, and was noted by Captain John Smith's map of Virginia. That site, a sacred site for the Monacan at the confluence of the Ravenna and James Rivers in Urbana County, was designated in 2020 as one of the most 11 endangered sites because of an effort to build a sewage and water treatment facility on that site. In my canoe trip this year, I passed by Rassawak and I pulled my canoe aside on river left and I met with Monacan tribal leaders to talk about their battle underway to save Rassawak. And within a few months after my passage by the island and my visit with Monacan leaders in August, the community came together and announced that the the site for the water treatment facility was going to be moved and Rasselbeck would be saved. So I've seen the National Trust bring attention to critical cultural resources, and that attention then enables leverage to be applied to come up with better solutions. So that makes me optimistic that the site that I passed by further downriver on River Left, Jamestown Island, though endangered by climate change, with the combined efforts of those who are gathering together today, we can save Jamestown Island for future generations as well. There's reason that we should have utmost faith in this alliance. So I'm going to bring your message with me to the Senate and urging my colleagues to enact bold policies to mitigate climate change and adapt to impacts like sea level rise and extreme weather. And I'll just also mention to you that your timing is good, because the commitment that we have made to dramatic infrastructure investments, and the infrastructure bill was passed late in 2021, includes dollars that can be used for projects such as this. So you always have to compete for federal dollars, but it's easier to compete for federal dollars when there's dollars to be had. And the commitment to infrastructure, including infrastructure so that we can deal with the effects of climate change, those dollars are on the table in a way that they weren't even a year ago. And the infrastructure bill we did will provide funding over the course of the next 10 years. So I look forward to working with Senator Warner and other Virginian members of our congressional delegation to do what we can to support the important work that you're doing. Thanks, Elizabeth, and all of you for having me today.
Thank you, Senator. We're truly grateful that you could join us and your busy day, and we're grateful for your leadership for the Commonwealth and for this nation. So thank you. I think we were going to close if there were a few questions that we could answer at this time. We'll certainly know that we'll need your support as we move forward. We are grateful for your being here today, but today is the first day of a journey that we'll all take together. Jim?
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you to all of our speakers. Those of the members of the press, if you would like to ask us any questions, we can just convene outside of the church, which has the added incentive of coffee, tea, and croissant out there. So please join us, and we'll answer your questions. Those of you that aren't members of the press, you can ask questions as well. So come and join us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
You've seen portions of that.
I have not.
Oh, okay.
And I watched on the postage stamp from there.
We can share this.